Firing line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Annenberg Foundation and the Friends of Firing Line.
Lester Thurow, a frequent guest on this program, is at it again. I mean another book addressing fundamental economic and indeed social themes. It is called The Future of Capitalism, and its subtitle is How Today's Economic Forces Shape Tomorrow's World. Its predictions and extrapolations are as ever intriguing and suggest to this reader that the United States is a beleaguered country. We'll see. You may want to take notes. Mr. Thurow is professor of economics at MIT, where he served as dean of MIT's Sloan School of Management. He graduated from Williams, then went to Oxford and took his doctorate at Harvard. He was a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under Lyndon Johnson, and in 1980 wrote the seminal book Zero-Sum Society. Let's begin with one theme treated in the book, which is that in the future, only human skills and training will be competitive. Let me ask Mr. Thurow, by that, do I understand you to say that the fungibility of capitalism is such that down the road every country will be more or less equally endowed in capital?
No, I don't think that's right at all, because it depends on how much investment you're willing to do, both private and public. You know, if you look at what I call man-made brainpower industries in the book, they depend on fundamentally two things. Are you doing the research and development to create new industries like biotechnology or the internet industry? And are you creating the skills for the workers? And if you look
but I acknowledge that you distinguish the skills of the worker from the capital plant. And I understand your thesis is that since it's as easy to build one in France, or for that matter in Asia, it's the people who are going to provide the competitive factor.
Absolutely, their knowledge. And see, if you look at biotechnology, the equipment is basically trivial. What counts is the brain power that you can do recombinant DNA, figure out if you tweak this gene, you cure that disease, and that's a people skill. And of course, one of the problems it creates for capitalism is traditionally, if you said, why did the capitalists replace the feudalist in making decisions? The answer, of course, was the steam engine, and the capitalist owns the steam power and the equipment that was attached to it.
But no longer relevant.
And that's really no longer relevant if you look at these new industries. And so what I'm arguing is that capitalism will start to look more like investment banks, law firms, consulting firms, which are capitalist business firms, but they run in very different ways than General Electric or General Motors run. So you have less hierarchy, the workers choose the president, and it's very difficult to run these firms as capitalist firms in the sense of listing them on the stock market. The best example, of course, is Salomon Brothers. Warren Buffett, supposedly America's shrewdest capitalist, buys Salomon Brothers. One generation of partners at Salomon Brothers makes a lot of money, but then why should the young rainmakers work for Warren Buffett? What does he give them? Well, they need a computer screen, but that's so cheap they can buy it for themselves. And so what you see at Salomon Brothers is the high-earning young partners are leaving, and it's not obvious what Warren Buffett is going to be left with. The shareholders may end up with an empty hole.
Well, to the extent that it becomes progressively easier for American capital, or anybody's capital, to go to a country in which the labor rates are cheaper, what's to prevent them from going to the same countries and training there that which does provide competitive leverage, highly trained people?
You see some of that already. For example, Motorola's got a design team making their newest chip where half the people work in Chicago, and it takes some very expensive equipment to make chips, and half the people work in Bangalore, India. And at the end of every day in Chicago, they basically electronically send all the information to Bangalore, India. The guys in India, who are, of course, working in their daytime but our nighttime, work essentially the night shift on that chip, and at the end of their day, they ship it back to Chicago. And so you got one piece of equipment being used by people in both Bangalore and Chicago, and you're working 24 hours a day building a semiconductor chip, using some third world skills as well as some first world skills. So there will be some of that. But, you know, the real trick is, you know, if you think about this kind of learning that creates those kind of industries, it usually requires some enormous economies of scale and some enormous time input. It's very hard, once Microsoft has got its position, to take that position away from Microsoft. It takes more than just 3 smart people.
Well, but inasmuch as you tell us that what's going to matter is training and skills.
And R&D.
Yeah, right. And R&D. Well, doesn't that suggest that the far-seeing, strategically well-oriented American companies will train people where it's easier and cheaper to train them, or is it that the facilities to train them with that sophistication aren't available?
No, I think there's a real danger of that, and see, that's where social investment comes in. Because, you know, if you simply say, as a company, I want a bright, hardworking, good high school graduate, why not go to China?
Right.
You get them for $35 a month as opposed to what you'd have to pay in the United States.
And the answer to that question is what?
Well, the answer to that question is if all the American high school graduate has to offer is the education they've got as a high school graduate, the answer is they're in deep trouble. And of course, that's one of the reasons why, if you look at the wages for males in the bottom 60% of the population, which is basically are the high school graduates, their wages are falling. In a global economy, economists call that factor price equalization, because if you move production to cheaper places and immigrants move into the United States to get higher wages, that tends to globally equalize wages. The wages go up in Bangalore, India, and they go down in the United States, because in the old days you could have third world skills, but if you lived in the United States you'd get what I would call an American premium, because you worked with American natural resources, American equipment, other bright, well-educated Americans. But today, if I'm running a semiconductor operation and I need to do test, which is an unskilled thing, I put the chip on an airplane, send it to the Philippines, do the test in the Philippines, and then bring it right back to the United States. And so today, if you have third world skills and you live in a first world country like the United States, you're probably going to make a third world income. On the other hand, if you have first world skills and you live in Bangalore, India, you can make something very close to a first world income while you still live in a third world country, because you have access to the same technology, the same equipment in the case of semiconductor chip manufacturing.
Well, in your judgment, does this become a political question, i.e., is there a moment at which it becomes the obligation of the government to say, you can't do that anymore?
Well, I think Mr. Buchanan came very close into making it a political question in this election.
That's right, he tried to.
And see, I think, you know, the interesting thing is, in this election, is going to be, are Dole and Clinton going to address this issue? I mean, the falling wages for the bottom 60%, or are they going to try and walk away from it? Now, my suspicion is they're going to try and walk away from it because it's a very hard problem to solve. On the other hand, if it doesn't get solved, you know, 4 years from now, whoever's the new Pat Buchanan, you know, instead of getting 25% in the primaries, will get 40% in the primaries. And eventually we'll have a Pat Buchanan that wins, because in our society, democracy runs the system. And if you have a majority of the population with falling wages for a long time and you still maintain democracy, it's very hard to figure out how in the long run they simply don't say, stop the game, it's over, we want a different game because we, the majority, are consistently losing in this game.
Well, it's a hard situation to stop. It's also not that easy to document. In the last couple of weeks, there have been two pieces I can think of, one by Mr. Eisner, one by Mr. Stein, simply challenging one of the assumptions in your book, namely that wages are in fact falling. Well, you have a poverty line that is static at 13%, but the people who receive less than $10,000 are spending $19,000. And this is kind of difficult to...
No, but we're not talking about here about poverty. What we're really talking about is falling wages for people...
blue-collar wages.
Blue-collar wages for people who are working. And there's just nobody I have seen has argued that white male high school graduates don't have falling wages. Now, the only way you can do it is if you say we are grossly overestimating inflation. And therefore you don't make the kind of inflation correction.
Position, yeah.
But see, the problem is if we're grossly overestimating inflation, then in some sense we ought to be firing Alan Greenspan, because he's really fighting ghosts, because to make that kind of an adjustment, inflation has to be negative in the United States. And if inflation is negative in the United States, we don't need Alan Greenspan stepping on the economic brakes.
Now, you're a member of a profession that is, in my judgment, obliged to tell the American people, are we overestimating inflation? Why isn't that addressed?
Oh, I think we are. See, the point I make in the book is I think the fall in wages is somewhat exaggerated because we are, in fact, overestimating inflation. That's what I say in the book.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
And so I don't think the fall is as big as the 20% estimate, which is what it would be true if you just looked at the data and then made the inflation correction.
Well, to what extent does that have an impact on your judgment that blue-collar wages are falling? Does it just mitigate it, that's all?
No, sure, it mitigates it, but see, I think...
correct it.
But see, I think the other problem that you've really got to think about is the real crunch is ahead and not behind. Because, you know, every social system does some things badly and some things well. The second world, the communist world, ran lousy economies, but in generally they ran good school systems. And so the second world, of course, hasn't played in this ball game until 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And as you integrate the second world into the first world, you're going to see some dramatic changes in wages, not just at the bottom. For example, the Soviet Union has 700,000 well-educated scientists and engineers. Why should I pay an American physicist $75,000 a year when I can get a Nobel Prize winner in the Soviet Union for $100 a month? And we've already got American companies that have set up engineering groups in St. Petersburg, which they manage electronically, and they get good engineering for the equivalent of $100 a month. And so you're going to see some enormous effects when the second world starts to kind of roll into the first world. We already see it at the bottom because of China. Of course, it started moving to the market in 1978, much earlier than the Soviet Union, but China is not full of well-educated people. Russia was full of well-educated people, especially in the sciences and the engineering, and when they learn a few market skills, they're going to put some downward pressure. An American college not too long ago advertised a physics job. They had one physics job and almost 600 people applied for the job, and more than half of them came from the old Soviet Union. Because a Soviet physicist or chemist, electrical engineer is perfectly capable of teaching in an American university. A lot of them know English, and they're perfectly up to snuff when it comes to the science.
But traditionally, I think statistics of that kind tend to be tamed, don't they, by economic, by the application of economic principles, Say's law and...
wages are not going to go down to Indian levels. That's certainly true.
Right.
But you get some equalization, and so you have this kind of feeling of pressure. And that's what Mr. Buchanan was, picking up. Take the issue that he made into a really hot issue, this explosion of CEO salaries. Mm-hmm. Where, according to the Wall Street Journal, in the last 25 years, they've gone up from 35 times that of the average worker to 216 times that of the average worker. See, that might be explosive in any circumstance, but when it's really explosive is when the people at the bottom think their wages are falling in absolute terms. And so it's not just a relative change. And I think that's what made people so mad about Mr. Allen at AT&T. Because here he gets a big wage increase, and at the same time a whole group of people whose income is basically reduced to zero because they get fired. And in the American process, that may be capitalism, but people don't think of it as fair.
You tend to treat all these subjects as politically justiciable events. I tend not to, by which I mean I see no movement that's philosophically sanctioned that says when the disparity goes from 30 to 230, it justifies action.
Oh, I don't think there's any.
I
don't think there's any philosophy out there that says it does. It's human nature that says it does. And the answer is, Mr. Buchanan was able to get a lot of very excited people excited when he was willing to press those buttons.
Yeah, it is a temptation to the populace to point to things of that nature, and has been throughout the century. Conspicuous consumption in Newport, for instance, the kind of stuff that got Upton Sinclair or agitated. But your approach is different. I remember an exchange we had a few years ago in which managed trade was something which you spoke about enthusiastically. And that is a step, is it not, in using political mechanisms to try to affect economic points for political reasons.
Sure. No, I think there are places where that's called for. For example, if you take research and development, technology policy plays an important role in a country's economic success in the future. Take the two industries at the moment that are the hottest economically, people would most like to be in, biotech and the internet industries. Mm-hmm. Where did those come from? Well, in the case of biotechnology...
MIT?
No, in case of, well, partly. But 30 years ago, somebody at the National Institutes of Health said, hey, there's something in biology. So they started putting $2 to $3 billion a year into biotechnology. At that time, it was called biophysics. Half a dozen years later, you had the double helix. A half a dozen years after that, you had DNA. Then a few years later, recombinant DNA, the Harvard mouse. 30 years later, you've got an explosive, important private industry. But it took 25, 30 years of social nourishment, because using discounted net present values, no capitalist is going to make an investment today that doesn't pay off for 30 years. Or take the internet. The internet was set up 25 years ago by the Defense Department as an atomic bomb-proof communication system. Nobody had heard the word personal computers. They hadn't yet been invented. For the first 20 years, the Defense Department pays for it. For the next 10 years, the National Science Foundation pays for it. Today, it's the hottest thing in the capitalist world. All kinds of people setting up exciting companies, virtual wine shops, all kinds of good things. But here again, it took that investment and that social nourishment in order to make it happen.
Yeah, and you can trace a lot to the satellites, for instance,
sure,
the whole GPS.
The GPS system was basically part of get a missile to hit somebody else's missile silo.
Yeah, but all that tells us, isn't it, is that there will be opportunistic opportunistic exploitation of technology, however it's
well, but
developed.
you see, something else is going on. What I'm arguing in this book is that there's several fundamental forces that come together that change the nature of the system. And one of the things that just is going to be mind-boggling is we're going to be the first human society dominated by the elderly. In every other human society, they've been a minority. And see, they're already bending government budgets. If you go back to 1960 and if you look at the federal budget, half the expenditures would be on things that we could classify as investment: infrastructure, R&D, education, skills. Today, that's down to 15% because the entire federal government budget is basically going to pensions and health care for the elderly. Way over half of Bill Clinton's budget goes to people over the age of 65. And one of the problems you've got is by about 2025, we'll have a voting majority of the elderly. More than 51% of the voters will be over the age of 65. They won't be a majority of the population, but since we don't let people 0 to 18 vote, they're a voting majority. How do you get people who've, on average, got 8 years left to live to have a time horizon that's long enough that allows you to do something like biotech or the internet? Unless you scare the hell out of them with an enemy like communism, but we don't have any enemies anymore to scare them.
Well, 20 years ago in a book I wrote, I advocated indexing Social Security, and it seemed to me that so obvious a step in the right direction. You're still using the term 65 the way it was used in the days of FDR, but medical science has simply made that absolutely obsolete.
Well, I point out, you know, Bismarck invented the 65 retirement age in 1883.
There you are, yeah.
And at the time he invented it, the average German lived to be 46. And so it's like us saying you get Social Security, but not till you're 95, 20 years after normal life expectancy. If that was the problem, there wouldn't be a big expenditure problem as far as governments are concerned on the elderly. But, you know, if you know, there's a real revolution here if you talk about the private economy. In 1970, the average person 70 years of age had 40% less money than the average person 30 years of age. Today, the average person 70 years of age has 20% more money.
You mean prospectively?
No, right now.
Right now.
Right now. In the future, they'll have even more. And so if you're in the business world...
Why should that not be, by the way, since you've worked for 40 years longer?
Well, because they're not working at the moment.
They're not looking after their children.
Right. And of course, the other answer is if you look at Social Security, for the first 4 years you're on Social Security, you've paid your own way.
Right.
After 4 years, you're on welfare in exactly the same sense that the welfare mother's on welfare, in the sense that you've used up all you've paid in plus interest during your first 4 years of payments. Because our Social Security system is not a trust fund system, it's a system of intergenerational transfers where you tax the young to give it to the poor. Now see, I have parents in the 80s and I have my children who are in their 20s. And you know, somebody my age has to think, do I want to make my parents rich at the cost of making my children poor? And I think the answer is no. Now if you take the 40% gap in 1970 where the 70-year-old was 40% down from the 30-year-old, we can say, hey, maybe that was too big and we should have raised Social Security. On the other hand, I don't know any social principle, left or right, that says you want to teach poor people, the 30-year-old, to give money to the 70-year-old who's richer than the 30-year-old. As a transfer payment system, whatever you think about transfer payments, that just wouldn't seem very sensible. But you know, the way this ties into these kind of man-made brain power industries is traditionally government is the place where you've paid for long-tailed research and development. And what's happening is, if you look at our government budget, is that kind of long-tailed investment is getting driven out. If you look at infrastructure, for example, we're not doing anything like the interstate highway system anymore. We're putting about half as much money into infrastructure. Now, that particular piece of infrastructure had an enormous payoff for the private economy. Trucks could go longer without having the engines rebuilt. You needed fewer warehouses. There was a lot of private money made off the improvements in the American economy caused by the interstate highway system.
So I think it's a perfectly intelligent question to say, look, manifestly, you can't raise capital for a venture, the payoff date of which would be 25 years from now.
Right.
Under the circumstances, it has to be done by government, if it's to be done. Now, the question then often arises, ought it to be done? The landing on the moon, I kind of think of as sort of an aristocratic escapade. It may be said to have paid off anomalously. We discovered things that we didn't anticipate discovering.
Right. Yeah.
I think probably did. But you couldn't have raised capital for that enterprise from the private sector.
Oh, absolutely. But see, I think if you think about what's the nature of human beings, part of the nature of human beings, if you think about optimal budgeting, is everybody should have a great adventure fund.
Yeah.
And, you know, some part of your money should be put into great adventures. And for humankind as a group, The great adventures are discovering new things like biotechnology or the internet.
Or America, yeah.
Or America, Columbus. And so I think, I mean, there's no question this is a bit like Las Vegas gambling. But if you refuse to gamble at all, and you refuse to do any of those great adventures, 30 years from now you won't have the equivalent of the internet, biotechnology. And fusion power, the kinds of things we're going to assume are going to be here to give our children or grandchildren a high standard of living.
Yeah, but excuse me for being fixated on this point. What is it that distinguishes between the political and the private here? You pointed to one, namely the amount of money needed to stoke an escapade that might not pay off. That's number one. But number two, should the presumptions against government engaging in this activity survive?
Well, see, I think, let me tell you what I think the presumptions ought to be on R&D.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a project where it's reasonable that it's going to pay out within the next 5 years in the sense of a marketable product, private enterprise ought to do that.
Mm-hmm.
If it's doing basic research where you know that it's not going to lead to a marketable product within 10 years, the answer is some kind of social situation. Let's say the government is going to have to pay for that because private enterprise isn't if you decide you're going to do it. Now, this area between kind of 6 and 10 years, you can argue about what kind of a mix. The Europeans have these projects called Jesse, Eureka, Esprit,
right,
where the government throws in half, the industry throws in half, and both sides have a veto. If the industry won't put in half, it doesn't get done. So what the government is basically doing is lengthening time horizons and encouraging industry to work on a set of projects which if industry was paying for them 100%, they wouldn't do. But, I think the answer is if you refuse to have the visions, the Columbus visions, the biotechnology visions, the internet visions, then you become a lesser society.
Well, now, is this being done currently on a massive scale or only in little microcosmic scale? That big thing in Texas experimenting with energy.
The super colliding.
The super colliding business.
Right.
Now is that a fiasco?
Superconducting super collider. It ended up not being built.
Yeah, right.
And it ended up not being built.
Having spent what?
Well, we'd spent some money, but we're going to have to spend a lot more money in order to complete it. And there you have a judgment on some project like that. Somebody has to make a judgment. Is this a reasonable gamble or not a reasonable gamble? Now, I think that was the case where even most physicists would have said it wasn't a reasonable gamble. Now, a lot of them were for doing it because whole careers had been staked on it.
Well, but also there was a public demand for a solution to the energy crisis, right?
Right. That's partly how it got started. But, by the time we were actually building the machine, that crisis was gone.
Yeah.
And we were worried about something else.
Well, is most of what we're talking about stuff that is done by individual physicists or a team of physicists in MIT or wherever, backed by government grants?
Yeah, if you look at this kind of long-tailed research, the government one way or another is paying for it. Now, there used to be a few exceptions in private industry. They were called the Bell Labs, the IBM Labs, the RCA Labs. And if you have an industrial firm who's a quasi-monopoly like AT&T, then they'll have a very long time horizon. But if you look at the Bell Labs today, they're not the Bell Labs of 15 years ago. IBM, when it became a competitive firm, got into trouble, went through its laboratories, took out $6 billion worth of research spending. They simply stopped everything that wasn't expected to pay off in a 6-year period of time, which is rational if you're into a competitive computer world. But somebody's got to do those longer-tailed projects if you're going to have something to work on out there in the future.
Well, but what generates a felt demand for such a project usually has been defense.
Defense has been the traditional, defense and health have been the two places.
Defense and health, right.
In defense, and the reason, of course, is in defense, we don't worry about cost, it's performance. If my airplane flies at 4,000 miles an hour and yours it flies at 5, I'm in trouble.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm always interested in more performance, even if it costs billions of dollars to get the more performance. The same thing, of course, is true if you look at healthcare. We don't pay much attention to cost because if this machine will save my life, I want it, even if it costs all the rest of the money I have. And so if you look...
So those are the two traditional. What are some non-traditional? What are some non-traditional ventures of the kind?
Well, one of them would have been the Bell Labs, where it was basically the telephone industry, and since it was set up as a quasi-monopoly with AT&T, they had a lot of money that they could throw back into the research budget. They knew they'd been around for 100 years. They thought they were going to be around for another 100 years. And so if you look at developments in telecommunications, that wasn't driven by either health or defense. It was driven by this private regulated monopoly.
Well, what then, to quote the title of your book, what would you say the future of capitalism is?
Well, what I argue in the book is it's going to be different. It's going to be. I use the metaphor of punctuated equilibrium for biology, where you have 130 million years of dinosaurs, then you have a period maybe as short as 10,000 years, which the biology
evolution,
calls punctuated equilibrium, and out the other side comes mammals.
Right.
And the question is, what's coming out the other side? Because I'm arguing that we're, at the moment, in a period of punctuated equilibrium. Well, one thing I think is we're moving from basically an era of natural resource-based industries into an era of man-made brain power industries. One of the things that does is it means we're going to run our business firms differently, because they're going to start to look more like investment banks, consulting firms, because the business firm doesn't own a steam engine, which is its key strategic asset. It's got this brain power, but the problem is the brain power actually belongs to some human being. And since we don't have slavery, the firm can't legally own the brain power. And so the question is, how do you attach these people to the firm? How do you make sure that you have the right set of knowledge workers?
And capitalism will have to cope with those changes.
That's right. See, the other thing capitalism is going to have to cope with is a very different age structure. For example, if you think of electronic shopping, technically, within a very short period of time, we'll be able to close every store in America, every retail store in America.
Technically. Yeah.
Technically. The question then is, what are we going to want to buy in a social experience, and what are we just going to want to buy on our TV screen?
Thank you, Professor Lester Thurow, author of The Future of Capitalism. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Next week on Firing Line, host William F. Buckley, Jr. talks with Harvard professor Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, author of Hitler's Willing Executioners, who says that a heavy majority of the German people were compliant in the Holocaust.
This program was a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support was provided by the Annenberg Foundation and the Friends of Firing Line. For information about a video cassette of this program,